In Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, Scott Pilgrim isn't in most of the show because of the Hollywood feminist agenda. The bait and switch first episode, a gentle retelling of Volume 1 set like a Toronto-based version of the Monogatari series, sees Scott get murked by my brother Matthew Patel, and instead Ramona is thrust into the spotlight. What I enjoyed the most about the show was the art direction and animation, testament to Netflix's partnership with Japanese animation studios. Stylistically, it builds on the fluidly animated Western-style designs of Science Star's previous work, Panty and Stocking. The quality of animation here simply cannot be found in the West, the Anglosphere, whatever you want to call it, in easy demand. Not because Japanese people are genetically good at animating or anything, but more because their labor laws are less a series of protections and more a form of indentured servitude. I am a slut for the Sakuga Twitter account, and I can see a lot of shots from Scott Pilgrim Takes Off ending up in there. I'm also a slut for women and minorities. Airtime is extended for all of the women in Scott's life, not just Ramona, but Julie, Kim, Knives, and Roxy. The latter of which arguably gets the most catharsis because the girls stay winning. The series' only non-beige character, Matthew Patel, the first ex with the least screen time, defeats Gideon and is fleshed out as a neurotic theatre kid who sets off a series of events that leads to closure for not only him but all 7 evil exes. I finally feel comfortable handing Brian Lee O'Malley his waging card. We get to hear known backgammon player Wallace Wells fucking on screen and a resolution to his whorish ways.
Are real?
Ostensibly a heterosexual romance between Scott and Ramona, the series devotes far more time to gay kisses and gay sex. We don't see any straight fucking at all, and when Scott does return, he and Ramona are prevented via nanobot from being able to kiss until the very end. This is clearly Brian Lee O'Cuckoldry's evil gay plan, and as a part of a gay plan myself, I gotta respect it. He laid the groundwork in the early 2000s and he's delivering on it here. The villain of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is, to no one's surprise, Scott Pilgrim, except a much older, very divorced version of himself. The most notorious aspect of the Scott Pilgrim franchise is that Scott Pilgrim is dating a teenager, which is sometimes taken as the narrative's endorsement of noncery, largely by people who only watch the film, which leans more heavily into Scott and Knives as a viable couple. It was even written with them originally ending up together. I think this is a fair criticism of the film, the strengths of which lie unambiguously in the style, humor, and direction. But even in the film, enough of the book's DNA remains where Scott's actions are both challenged and invalidated. And none of this is like the books, which are almost entirely about Scott Pilgrim becoming a better person, both with and without Ramona. Media illiteracy and purity culture are often cited as reasons that some people are repelled by protagonists who do sex crimes, or sometimes just bad things in general. I think this is a little unfair. While this may be the case for some, usually younger people, I think it's reasonable to question whether or not the narrative that you are consuming is portraying power dynamics in a way that reflects reality and doesn't launder male responsibility. I don't think that any entry in the Scott Pilgrim franchise readily endorses Scott as a good person or validates him for dating a teenager, with the film coming the closest given the least generous reading. In Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, this couldn't be clearer. O'Malley's fatigue at having to answer, is Scott a bad person for 20 years straight, is showing. Scott's friends even ditch him at the party from Volume 1. And of course you also have older, very divorced Scott as the final boss, which could have felt tired and too meta in less competent hands. Thankfully, the bulk of the narrative is Ramona dealing with the harm that she's caused to her exes, namely cheating on and or ghosting them when she feels like she's getting too attached. This feels like a sequel to a lot of the ideas we saw explored in Volume 6 of the comics, where Ramona gets neat-pilled in a similar manner to Scott, failed daughtering around her parents' house, avoiding her problems. Her arc in the anime deals with her confronting that part of herself. The impetus of the series is Ramona choosing to chase the supposedly murdered Scott despite having only gone on one date with him, with his disappearance being the catalyst for her to confront her past and ultimately fight to not only love Scott Pilgrim but to love herself enough to stop running away in general. I found this fulfilling and interesting as an emotionally driven standalone narrative for first-time viewers, all surrounded by insane cartoonish action of the highest caliber, and it's interesting to see a hot girl pursue a loser to the end of the earth because while we don't see it on screen very often, there are many such cases in real life. That being said, the series does have heavy meta elements, with Scott Pilgrim's life being adopted twice within the 8-episode run into both a West End musical and a young Neil penned blockbuster. Well, not really young Neil, but whatever. It is easy to read this as Brian Lee O'Malley's final goodbye to the series, a way of preempting any future cash grabs. With old Scott a grotesque parody of himself, unwilling to move on from his past love. I'm talking about creating the universe of Scott Pilgrim, not his divorce. he's maintained that he is not Scott Pilgrim. He does not want that reading. I think the series is good enough to be judged on its own merit, and its narrative consistency doesn't crumble under the weight of its meta commentary and callback. The Evil X's gain the most here, with a lot of them gaining whole episodes fleshing them out, culminating in the final fight where they all team up. The meta elements are the dressing, but the characters are the salad. Do you get me? I think the series is doing more than just playing around with the Scott Pilgrim IP or doing fan service in its character exploration. Okay, now I'm going to get onto insane cultural commentary, so put your tinfoil hats on. In the cultural zeitgeist, Scott Pilgrim to me is the definitive North American anime. Just as Scott Pilgrim 2003 was the definitive Anglosphere presence in the form of manga, Scott Pilgrim 2023 is now that for anime. Building on Panty and Stocking's combination of Western adjacent designs combined with fluid expressive animation and amazing fight choreo, yet set firmly in Toronto. What the fuck? Anime has established itself firmly in the Western mainstream in the past few decades, but barring the odd Castlevania, there is no real answer to anime as a cultural import when it comes to adult narrative animation. Scott Pilgrim takes off is TVMA. Also, superheroes don't count. I think a lot of people, myself included, were hoping for a moody, slower paced adaptation of the comics in the vein of the Adult Swim short produced a decade ago. However, I see why the creators have chosen to break untrodden ground instead with regard to integrating Scott Pilgrim's anime roots with an anime adaptation with a new action-oriented narrative. A lot of what I loved about the comics, its dark, depressing reality with the fantastical elements more out of focus, is not in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Lisa, one of my favorite characters from the comics, is again absent from this adaptation. She stays losing, but I see why. In the comics, her moving to Scott and him eventually rejecting her is the first time in a narrative where Scott actually tries to become a better person, leading to Scott getting a job, trying to mature his relationship with Ramona, her pulling away, and the combination of the book's exploration of coming to terms with being hurt and hurting others in a relationship. Scott says to Gideon that he understands him before killing him, because the books are a realization of Scott Pilgrim's arc as a character, whereas in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, he just takes off. As a book fan, I also didn't love seeing Envy get flanderized as a jealous bitch, whereas in the comics she's more of just a bad bitch with a great deal of sympathy for Scott, which he rejects. However, her role in the anime adaptation is much more reduced. Instead of being a menacing presence hovering over early chapters, she is a minor villain in Ramona's X of the Week Persona style confrontation, which works well in the anime adaptation. I can imagine you fans still loving this version of Envy, and that's okay, the books are still there. But all in all, I think Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is an incredible show that you should watch. 0 out of 10. Burn down the studio, execute Brian Lee O'Malley for his crimes against Envy.
Small last was all you get lost here. Falling on that mission, 'cause the boys